In the church, even outside of the church, how do we deal with false teaching? How do we deal with people, whether they know it or not, people, whether it is intentional or not, people, whether it is devastating or not? How do we deal with people that are teaching false things, that are engaging in false teaching that even is hurting people? How do we do this? As a Bible college professor, one of the things that I know is that this is an important topic that a lot of people are questioning, not just inside of an institution like Ozark, but also inside of the church. And as our society that we're in America continues to trend away from the Christian norms of 50, 60, 70, 100, 200 years ago, one of the things that becomes increasingly more obvious is that Christian leaders are agitated with all of the false teaching. And you can just go from topic to topic to topic of all the different elements of false teaching that need to be combated. But the question is how do we do it effectively? Or maybe even let me ask it a different way. How does the Bible instruct people living in an increasingly hostile society to the gospel? How is it that Christians are to respond? How is it that we combat this teaching? How is it that we fight for what is true? This whole concept came up to me because it came up for me when I was reflecting on a lecture I'd just given in one of my classes. And it wasn't even the text that we're going to be going through today, 2 Timothy chapter 2. It wasn't even the main text of the class. It just happened to come up. And we began wrestling with the odd instruction that Paul gives to Timothy that I think that if he was speaking to us today, he would give to us. See, Timothy's in a tough ministry. Timothy's in Ephesus, and Ephesus is not one of those smooth sailing cities for the gospel. Ephesus is a city that is deeply rooted in the love and worship of Artemis. It is even taught or believed at the time of the first century that Artemis, one of the twin children of Zeus, was born through a tree in the city of Ephesus. Their claim to fame was a false teaching, was the worship of a deity that had nothing to do with the Trinity. And they were deeply dedicated to the worship of Artemis and to all that goes with it, like magical incantations and curses and spells. And it was a big deal. Where do we get this? Well, in Acts chapter 19, Paul comes into the city of Ephesus. And after the situation with the sons of Sceva, who were actually beaten by a demonically possessed person, because Jesus I know, Paul I'm aware of, but who are you? If you don't remember that story, read Acts 19. It's startling. But then it says, whenever the people of Ephesus began to repent, they took all of their scrolls that were wrapped up in the worshiping of the false deities, their magic incantations, and it totaled to over 50,000 drachmas. Just to give you an idea, you're talking tens and potentially even hundreds of millions of dollars worth of things that they burned to commit themselves to Jesus. And now here is Timothy, young in the faith, who's been left by Paul in the city of Ephesus to help the church grow. And Timothy, as the text tells us, is dealing with false teaching. He's dealing with false teachers that are both coming from outside the church and are coming from within the church itself. And so what I was expecting whenever I'm coming to chapter 2 of Timothy is for Paul to say, so sharpen your arguments. Make sure you have all of your apologetics ready to go. Make sure you memorize all your biblical passages. Make sure you keep going to church. Make sure you post on social media to let everyone know that you're against the issue. And strangely, that's not the advice Paul gives Timothy. He gives Timothy some advice that on the surface seems really stupid. But if we drill down a little deeper, we will see it's not only wisdom to Timothy, but it's something that we ourselves need to be confronted with. This is what he says in verse 22. Timothy, here's how you deal with false teachers. Flee the evil desires of your youth and pursue righteousness and faith and love and peace. Timothy, how do I want you to deal with the false teachers? Focus on transforming yourself. Focus on partnering with the Spirit to unearth what is broken in you. Become more like God. One of the things I find about God is He doesn't spend a lot of His time arguing with me whenever I'm wrong. He calls to me. He holds an anchor of the truth. But ultimately, God doesn't need to defend Himself. Because what God does is allow His character to bear witness to who He is and the truth of what He is saying. But there is a youthfulness to a desire to want to be right more than we want to be holy. There is an evilness to our desire to pursue social media posts more than we do faith, love, and peace. In verse 23, he says, don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments. How do you deal with the false teachers, Timothy? Don't get wrapped up in the web. There are more important things to do than to merely win an argument. He says instead, because you know they just produce more and more quarrels. He says, and the Lord's servant, verse 24, must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. And then he says this, verse 25, opponents must be gently instructed. How do we deal with false teaching? We deal with the false teachers the way that Jesus dealt with us when we were still enemies. He pursued us with love. He pursued us with truth, or with peace. Because ultimately the truth of God only makes sense in the context of the holiness of God. And the question then becomes this for us this week. In the false teaching that is happening in our own hearts and in the churches around us and in the world around us, is the most effective tool to sharpen an argument and to fight and try to win, to rationally make someone else feel stupid, to point out all the flaws in their argument, or is the most effective means by which to combat false teaching, is a holy life dedicated and centered on Jesus. My challenge for you this week is this. Spend this week in prayer of what God needs to clear out of your own heart, mind, and soul to draw closer to His righteousness, more than you even spend studying about the arguments for the gospel. Why? Because our greatest evangelism in the face of false teaching is a life that is fully transformed into the likeness of Jesus. And when we do that, church, the false teaching will no longer have an anchor to hold on to, because instead it will be more gravitating towards the light that is shining in the darkness. I love you guys. Have a good week.